Welcome back to the channel, folks, and to another painting guide. And the subject of this guide is a colour which is very close to my heart, and that is German Panzer Grey. To some people it is perhaps the most boring camo that you can apply to a tank because it is just grey. It's not three-tone camo, it's not ambush camo, it's not got all the attractive camo blotches and such likes. But to my eye there is so much about Panzer Grey that isn't obvious, so much that you can add to the overall grey appearance of the kit that really just helps them come alive on the tabletop, and that's something that's always appealed to me about painting German Panzer Grey. In addition to this guide, you can probably tell from the pictures here, I have done some railway flat cars, and there will be a guide to that coming out. But this video is going to concentrate on the Dicker Max and Sturer Emil, and I'll show you how I get this nice solid Panzer Grey that does modulate from dark to light, but doesn't get too light, folks, as Panzer Grey should be something dark and menacing to my mind. But anyway, let's get started. Airbrushing Vallejo paint, I recommend you use their dedicated airbrush thinner. It's perfect for the job in my experience. And also mixing the paint in a separate jar, don't mix it in the cup. I find that with Vallejo paint, unlike Tamiya, mixing it in the airbrush cup can cause clogs. The separate jar allows us to get a proper mix before we start putting any paint into the airbrush. Now here I'm just checking how much thinner I am using to see if it's going to make a good batch in terms of how much paint will eventually end up in the airbrush cup. Getting the right consistency of the paint is key to a good airbrush session. If it's too thick, you're going to have lots of problems. Too thin, well, that's only really going to be a problem if you're hitting the paint hard. A thin paint can be controlled if you've got the air flowing right, but you just want to get it just right, and you'll build it up with experience. I don't use precise proportions of thinner in paint, I just kind of work in similar sized volumes each time I'm painting so that I know roughly where I am. And then, for instance, I put the thinner, which is clear, in the cup or the mixing bottle, and then I put the paint in, and I know how much paint I'm putting in, I can see it going in, and then I know I'm kind of hitting the right proportions. When I mix it up, I can see that it's nice, thin, flowing paint that leaves a very, very thin amount of paint on whatever it is I'm mixing. I tend not to use brushes, I tend to use something solid so that I can see what thickness of paint is left on, in this case, the handle of the brush, and then I'll know if I've got something that I'm happy with. Then I can pour some of the mixture, or all of it if you're just making a small batch, into the cup, and we're ready to start. And we know that there's not going to be any clogs down by the needle, because if you mix it in the cup, sometimes unmixed paint can seep into the head of the needle. On to the airbrushing. Now, I've already given the kit a coat of German Grey. I'm now going to start lightening it, modulating, so to speak. Now this is very simple modulation because it's just going to be 3 steps. I'm going to apply the main colour here, and then I'll apply a highlight. And by the main colour, what I mean is I'm going to spray over all of the kit but leave some of the German Grey. The idea being that we're going to be going down the panels or across flat surfaces, going from light to dark, and then contrasting dark against light where panels meet each other, and that helps create shape and depth to the vehicle. You can use masking in this process. It can help you get, for instance, where the gun extends over the long hull of these vehicles, it can help you get a little bit of protection so that you're not going to have overspray, because you want to control where this highlight colour is going to go. But masking can slow things down. Here I think it's a very useful, essential bit of mask that you're going to use, but elsewhere masking can slow things down, and I quite often just find myself using my fingers. If you place your finger across a line, for instance, put your thumb across a line, you've got a bit of mask and you can quickly move on that way rather than applying and taking off masking. Here's a comparison side by side. The one on the bottom has been lightened, the one on the top hasn't. You can see I'm not going for an absolutely massive difference between the two, because this is the main colour we're applying at this stage, folks. this is not the highlight colour, we're building up towards the highlight colour, so we've got to be careful that we don't overdo it. Now there is still shade in that highlighted kit, it's just not obvious. It will become more obvious, or more visible shall we say, once the highlights have been applied. That highlight, when it is applied, tends to bring everything into focus, and that's the point at which you'll find out if you left too much shade. So how did I lighten the grey? What approach did I take? Well, I just went for something which was still quite dark and added a few drops to the mix that I already had prepared in the bottle, the leftover paint. And the paint I used here was dark rubber. Now that's quite a dark colour in itself. Remember, this is going to be our main colour. Dark grey is dark grey. We don't want it to become light grey, but we're going to lighten it. And it took a couple of passes for me to get the required level of lightness, or the required highlight in that mix. So be prepared to mess about if you're in unfamiliar territory, because you may need to remix. The Sturer Emil is quite a larger vehicle than the Dicker Max, so it is possible to leave a lot more shade on the kit than with the Dicker Max, but be careful you don't leave too much, because remember, the shade is just there to accentuate things, it's not to be the dominant colour. So just take your time and walk across areas and rework the areas that you're spraying. It is worth pointing out when you're doing this modulation, especially when you're doing a lighter colour over a darker colour, that the paint that you're spraying on is semi-opaque, so you're going to have to do a couple of passes, I would say, like minimum, especially putting on this main colour, otherwise the dark colour is going to dominate too much. Now there can be some small areas that are actually quite hard to airbrush, such as these little raised hatches and such likes, but if you're struggling with that, folks, don't forget you can do a degree of modulation by brush on smaller areas. You can just take a little bit of semi-opaque paint and just build up an area of brightness, across the rear of a hatch, or paint in a little bit of the shade colour if you've sprayed too much in. So you've got the brush to back you up. Now we're on to the highlight, folks, and what I've done here is added a very small amount, just a couple of pretty full drops, but just a couple of drops of London Grey to the mixture that we used for the main colour. So I'm not adding it to the German Grey, I'm adding it to the mixture of German Grey and dark rubber. When doing this 3-stage modulation, the purpose of the highlight is to bring edges into focus, and also to bring the change of colour across the surface into focus. By that I mean you'll more clearly see the shade, the main colour, then the highlight all together, because prior to the highlight the main colour may not stand out too strongly against the shade. So if we get this right, we're going to have a very nice shape with a nice depth across the panels and a nice steady change in colour, rather than really bright differences between all the layers, because we don't want to see that. We just want to see a steady change in the colour. So I am spraying very little highlights on, folks, keeping it really controlled. You can use masking once again, and you can see here I've used my thumb to mask certain areas just for quick progress. But personally, folks, I feel most painters, wargame painters that I see modulating, go wrong by putting on too strong or too thick a highlight. No, the highlight area itself is just too large. They need to just pull it back to the edges to get the focus that they're actually looking for. The final look will come down to personal choice, and it may be that painters out there want to have a really light dark grey, but I think personally, looking at what I've seen on social media, a lot of the time the highlighting process has just got out of hand, or it's just been too light a colour for the background colours. So have a look at this guide and make up your own mind, folks. I'm going to show you the Sturer Emil painting here, folks. Just going to let it play, not going to talk over it, and that'll give you a second chance to look at this highlighting process, and on a larger vehicle too, compared to the Dicker Max. Right folks, that's all the fun of airbrushing and modulation out of the way. Now we're on to a real chore, tracks and wheels. My approach to tracks is first of all giving them a coat of US olive drab. It's a nice dark, muddy, earthy, stony kind of colour that, it can be used for a lot of similar kind of tasks and gives a nice foundation, I find, for the tracks. Next up is a metallic dry brush, but it's more like a wet brush, to be honest folks. I'm not actually drying the brush or taking paint off. I just want a nice solid coat of metallic on the raised areas. Be careful you're not hitting the wheels too much here, and definitely not hitting the fenders. For the rubber tyres on the road wheels, I normally use dark rubber or a similar dark grey, but that's not really going to stand out at all against the grey background of the vehicle, so I'm going to use black here. At this point, I'm quite often going to put a bit of black on the rim, or I've already got a bit of metallic paint on the lower hull somewhere, so there's always going to be a bit of tidy up required, folks, so be prepared for that. It's not a problem. If it's going to save you time just to crack on and do a little bit of touch up, then that's better than killing yourself trying to paint absolutely precise road wheels when you're going to be covering it in a really heavy weathering wash anyway. Be careful when you're handling the tracks at this point too, folks. Metallic paint can flake off. If you get it on your fingers, it will transfer to other areas of the vehicle. So you've got to watch how you're handling it. And when I've got all of these elements painted, now is a logical time prior to the wash of applying the gloss varnish coat. That will seal the tracks, protect the tracks, because they're metal and they're going to react badly to handling, but then it will also allow you to then apply the pin wash in a nice controlled way, as we're going to see in the next stage. For the pin wash, I'm going to be using MIG Ammo acrylic wash. This is a dark wash. It really acts like an enamel pin wash, folks. I highly recommend it. Now on the left you can see how it is coming out of the bottle. It's quite thick, there you go. And on the right you can see it with water added, so that I can then apply it in a much more thinned and controlled way as a pin wash. Pin washing is something you may be familiar with. If you're not, the first question you might want to ask is, why pin wash? Well, pin washing allows you to get the maximum depth out of your Mini. If you are applying the highlights in a very particular way with your airbrush, and then subsequently with the brush, and then applying your shade in a very particular way, first of all with the airbrush and then with the pin wash, you're going to get a very well defined shape that's going to have lots of depth, and it's really going to stand out on the tabletop. Here you can see me applying the pin wash to panel lines. See how it flows straight into that panel line, or along the weld lines. It just flows along the weld lines because we've got the right consistency with a particular type of acrylic paint that has got a very, very good flow consistency. Any wash that's gone into the wrong places, sitting on top of a panel, for instance, beside a panel line, I can very easily draw that off with a damp brush. Draw it straight off or draw it into the panel line. Now I would say it probably takes about 15 minutes to apply a pin wash to tanks of this size and complexity. You can of course get much quicker results by simply applying a wash to the entire vehicle and perhaps then removing it with a brush, but it's going to get a much darker finish if you go down that route. So get the right product and give pin washing a try if it's something you've not done before. After I've done the pin wash, I typically wash the lower hull. Now I'm going to use an enamel product for this just because it gives a nice earthy, gritty finish compared to an acrylic wash. There's no need to be too careful here, just don't splatter it all over the lower hull like the fenders and the front glasses and such likes. And then I'm going to use some thinner. Now this is an enamel product, so it's got to be thinner of some kind of enamel thinner or oil thinner, and then remove the excess until I've got it at the right consistency that I want. The drying time for enamels is much longer than acrylics. For instance, that pin wash, once it's touch dry, you'll be able to start working on the highlights. But this enamel wash, you're going to have to leave it really till the next day before you start handling the figure again. Otherwise you're going to be lifting paint off on your fingers, putting it who knows where. And incidentally folks, if you're interested in the flat cars as a subject, there'll be a tutorial coming out for them shortly. Now we're on to highlighting. Now I'm going to be approaching this in two ways. First of all is hitting what I call the external edges. These are the easy to reach edges where I can use the flat off a brush to just either draw a line along, or as you can see in many cases I'm bouncing a broken line along, because we're not trying to do edge highlighting here as you would see in Warhammer 40k for instance. What we want to do is brighten the edge without making the edge too distinct and too stark, and this broken edge will also start the chipping process. I'm using London Grey. Any similar light grey would do, but don't go too light on it folks. Here you can see me working on smaller features such as hinges and bolts and internal lines, you know, the lines between panels and hatches and such likes, where the flat of a brush isn't going to do it, so I'm going to have to use a better quality brush. The carefully controlled highlight next to the carefully controlled shade is really going to help accentuate the shape and make it pop on the tabletop. As with the pin wash process, you're going to spend about 50 minutes highlighting each tank. Now that includes the chipping process that's going to come next, but the chipping process itself is very quick. So for the chipping, we're going to keep that London Grey, going to keep that fine brush, and we're going to start to put little scratches across panels, you know, where we have already got a little bit of highlight on the edges. That could be the start point of some scratches. If you imagine coming across a panel from the edge, or you could have it just going through the panel mid vehicle for instance, and then a few little dots, little dashes, basically breaking up the surface. The aim with the chipping process is not only to make the vehicle look a bit more interesting and weathered, but to help bring a bit more focus to the overall kit. By that I mean panels, especially large panels, will seem very flat, featureless, and perhaps not stand out from the kit, and therefore not help make the kit have a particular shape and appearance. So when you start chipping panels, it brings them into focus, which helps create the shape that we're after, especially once again on the tabletop. Now unless you've got a particular historical subject in mind that you're basing your weathering on, don't overdo it. It's so easy just to go line, chip, dot, chip, line, and then before you know it, the thing looks as though it should be in a scrap heap, you know, not in active service. So don't put too many features on, and also keep the lines and the chips thin. When I'm chipping, I am normally applying a dark core to all these chips, or certainly to most of them, and I use German Camel Black Brown for that, and that kind of represents exposed metal. So the light grey is exposed paint, you know, a lighter version of the paint that hasn't been weathered like the outer surface has, and then the German Camel Black Brown is the dark exposed metal. But in this case I'm not going to do it, because the vehicle itself is already really quite dark and the black brown won't stand out particularly strongly. Now, as is always the case with these German vehicles, there's lots of tools spread all over the hull, so I painted them in a standard way. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail here. Suffice it to say that for wooden handles I start with flat earth as a shade colour and then use as a main colour new wood. Now for the metallics I normally use a non-metallic colour, normally dark grey over a shade colour of German grey with some London grey highlights, but they would just disappear into the hull for this particular colour scheme if I was to do that. So I had a little look around my collection of paints and I found Luftwaffe uniform, and that actually works really quite well. It's got a bluish tint, as you can imagine. It's grey, so it kind of looks like a bluish metal colour, a little bit too bright, you know, for the real world, so to speak, but it shows up very nicely against the dark grey of the hull. After painting all the tools, I give the clips and the tie downs that hold them in place just a little highlight with London grey. Nice simple little process there. There are a couple of areas on the kits where we can add a bit of rust, mostly on the Sturer Emil. Now I don't go over the top with rust, it's not something I typically paint on the hull itself. I keep it for certain features and make a feature of it. In this case I'm making the rust really bold, but there are other approaches and I do have videos in my playlist that you can check out to see how we do that. But here I'm going for really rusty, so I'm starting with a base coat of dark rust. Once I've got that painted on, I'm going to then start to build up a patina. The next layer is going to be light rust, and I'm just going to bounce that across the surface. On the track it's nice and easy because there are raised surfaces, recessed areas, so just hit those raised areas and keep it irregular. You're not trying to paint a solid layer on here, we want to create an uneven patina. I'm using a brush that's a bit worn, it's not got a fine point on it, so that I can bounce the brush, which is quite dry, but it's not a dry brush, remember, but you've got a quite dry paint on it, so it's going to dry with nice distinctive sharp edges as you would expect from rust. And I'm just going to create irregular patterns by just bouncing it over the surface. To finish off, I'm going to add a very small amount of small spots of yellowish rust. That just kind of helps bring it out a bit from the dark background. I don't do it on every area of rust, but I think it would help on this darker figure. And then don't forget the brackets, folks. I'm going to give them a little bit of highlight. I've left them grey because they're not going to be so affected by the heat that's affecting the exhaust and causing that paint to flake off and rust. Nice couple of neat lines with London grey to help them stand out. Now we're coming to the final stage, and that's going to be streaks and weathering on the hull, and I'm going to be using an acrylic product here again, folks. It's the MIG Ammo acrylic wash. You can use enamel products for this, and enamel products will give you a greater degree of control, and you may be more satisfied with that than with this product. But I find this product works great for wargaming. It's quick, it'll dry quick, and you can quickly move on from one stage to another and still get a great looking result, which I hope you agree with when you see the end of this. You can see I've added dots to where I want the streaks to start, and then using a very damp brush, not a wet brush, just damp, I've then drawn them down. If it's too wet, you'll know straight away because it'll just disappear, you know, and it'll flood across the surface. So do some, then wear it down a bit so it's not looking quite so strong, and when you need to, add in a few more dots and repeat the process. But don't overdo it, and don't leave those lines too strong, folks, or you're going to end up with something that looks streaky and unnatural. What we're doing here is looking for a weathered look that will tone down everything, help unify the surface and give it another visual feature, but one that is just adding to the overall picture and not dominating. Once you add a layer of matte varnish over it, you know, once we've finished the whole process, the lines will soften to a degree, so you need to practice a bit at this to get it just right, but you can still add a bit more to the matte varnish if you think a line is possibly too soft. So you can still come back to it to tweak it once you've got that final coat on. And I should point out that you want to get your decals on before you do the streaking. That way you can weather them down a bit. There is other ways of weathering the decals as well, folks. I find that, especially if you've got a really big bold decal, if you take a cotton bud and just put a tiny bit of dry pigment onto the end of it, just rub a little on a palette across the top and then rub it over the top of the decal, then it'll give it a sort of layer of dust or earth and really tone it down in a way that sets it back into the hull. And after that, folks, I will give it a careful coat of matte varnish so that it's dulled down nicely, but it's not overly done, because varnish is something that can really kill the subtleties of what we've done in terms of weathering and modulation, so it has to be applied carefully. I hope you found that interesting, folks. Maybe get you anticipating early war in version 4 when it does eventually come out, because I'm certainly looking forward to it. But as always, thank you for watching. Thanks to all the subscribers out there who are tuning in again, and to those people who tune in just from time to time to see what's happening on the channel. If you'd like to hit the subscribe button and hit the bell button, it'll help us out, and also means we'll definitely see you all on the next one.